Paul Jensen stood at the projector, mid-sentence about quarterly projections, when Chad Peterson cut him off. "Honestly, Paul, this is precisely why we're obsolete," Chad announced, a smirk spreading across his face, his gaze sweeping the hushed conference room. The air went out of Paul's lungs. His carefully prepared presentation, weeks of work, dissolved into a public spectacle of his own inadequacy, leaving him exposed and suddenly very old in a room full of younger eyes. Chad leaned back, crossing his arms. Some things just don't adapt. The fluorescent lights hummed above Paul Jensen's head, casting a pale, unforgiving glow on the empty conference room table. The echoes of Chad Peterson's words still resonated, a cold, clinical dismissal that had landed like a well-aimed punch. Paul adjusted his tie, a gesture more for comfort than necessity, feeling the slight pull of the knot against his throat. 22 years he had given this company, back when it was still George Miller's, not some faceless corporate entity. George had built it from the ground up, a proper Midwestern success story, founded on handshakes and good service. Now it was all algorithms and aggressive growth metrics. Paul walked back to his cube, the carpet feeling thinner under his feet than it used to. He passed Mike Johnson's desk. Mike, the quiet database administrator, looked up, offered a small, sympathetic nod, then quickly returned to his screen. Mike had been around long enough to see the shifts too. He knew how Chad Peterson operated, how the new guard was systematically dismantling the old structures, replacing them with a sleek, impersonal efficiency. Paul remembered a time when Mike would have offered a word, a shared complaint. Now everyone just kept their heads down, navigating the currents as best they could. The changes had started subtle after George Miller had sold the business off for what Paul imagined was a king's ransom, a retirement well-earned, everyone had said. But for those left behind, it felt more like an abandonment. George's daughter, Amy Miller, who had run the marketing department with an artistic flair that never quite fit the numbers game, was quietly moved out, her office absorbed into an open-plan design that Chad Peterson championed. Paul had seen her packing her box, a framed photo of her and George at a company picnic tucked under her arm. She had just offered a tired smile. "Time for something new, Paul." And then she was gone. Now, Chad Peterson was the CIO, an architect of digital transformation, a man who spoke in jargon that made Paul's stomach clench. Disruption, synergy, leveraging our core competencies, words that sounded important but often translated to layoffs and increased workloads. Chad had been brought in from a tech firm out of Minneapolis, sharp suits and sharper ideas. His first order of business had been to streamline, to cut the fat, as he'd put it in a company-wide email. Paul knew his own department was on the chopping block. His years of experience, once a badge of honor, now felt like a liability, a heavy anchor in a rapidly moving current. At home that evening, the kitchen smelled of roasted chicken. Susan, his wife, looked up from setting the table, her eyes scanning his face. She didn't need words. They had been together long enough for her to read the subtle lines around his mouth, the way his shoulders carried a little extra weight. She just placed a hand on his arm, a gentle squeeze. "Long day, honey?" Paul managed a weak smile. "Just typical. Chad's pushing hard on the new project." He didn't elaborate on the conference room humiliation. Susan had enough on her plate, trying to manage the household budget, watching their savings dwindle with the market's unpredictable whims. Their son, Mark, was starting college in the fall, a financial black hole they were still figuring out how to navigate. The stability of Paul's job, once an unquestioned given, now felt like a house built on shifting sand. He thought of Brenda Hayes from HR earlier that day. She had stopped by his desk asking for an updated resume. "Just for our internal records, Paul," she'd said, her voice smooth, her smile practiced. "We like to keep things current." He knew what it was, a formality before the inevitable. Brenda was a pleasant woman, always professional, but her pleasantries masked the cold, efficient machinery of corporate decisions. She was a con, just like him, albeit one tasked with delivering the bad news. Chad Peterson often invoked the name Robert Anderson, CEO of a rival firm, during his presentations. "Anderson's company is innovating, disrupting the market," he'd say, a thinly veiled threat to those who couldn't keep up. Paul had worked with Robert Anderson briefly years ago on a joint venture. Anderson was ambitious then, too, but not with this kind of ruthless edge. The game had changed. The rules were rewritten. Paul felt a dull ache behind his eyes. He picked up his fork, the weight of the day settling heavy in his chest. The chicken tasted bland. The days following the conference room incident felt colder, the air in the office thinner. Paul Jensen moved through his tasks with a methodical precision, his mind running a constant tally of his remaining projects, his pending emails, as if preparing for an unseen deadline. Chad Peterson's presence was a perpetual low hum of tension. Chad moved like a man on a mission, striding through the aisles, his voice crisp and decisive even during casual conversations, always hinting at future plans that never seemed to include Paul. The word downsizing hung unspoken in the air, a sword above everyone's head, but Paul knew it was aimed squarely at him. One Tuesday morning, an email landed in Paul's inbox from Brenda Hayes in HR. The subject line was innocuous. Meeting request, discussion. The requested attendees were just Paul, Brenda, and Chad Peterson. The lack of a specific topic, the unusual combination of attendees, felt like a premonition. He confirmed the meeting for later that afternoon, a knot tightening in his stomach. He worked through the rest of the morning, forcing himself to focus on a new data migration plan he'd been sketching out, a plan he now suspected would never see the light of day. At 3 o'clock, Paul walked to the HR conference room. Brenda Hayes was already seated, her hands folded neatly on the polished table, a soft, almost apologetic smile on her face. Chad Peterson entered a moment later, carrying a tablet, his expression neutral, professional. He didn't offer a handshake, just gestured to the empty chair opposite them. Paul sat down, his posture straight, his hands resting on his knees. Chad wasted no time. Paul, he began, his voice devoid of warmth, as you know, the company is undergoing significant strategic realignment. We're looking at a leaner, more agile future, focusing on emergent technologies. Your contributions over the years have been noted, and we appreciate your dedication. He paused, not for Paul to respond, but for dramatic effect. However, after careful consideration, we've decided to move in a different direction. Your position, effective immediately, has been eliminated as part of a restructuring. Brenda slid a folder across the table. Inside, Paul saw the severance package details, COBRA information, and a non-disclosure agreement. It was all there, laid out in neat, legalistic prose. We've tried to make the transition as smooth as possible, Brenda added, her voice soft, practiced. Your final pay and benefits information is all included. We'll need you to clear your desk by the end of the day. A security escort will assist you to ensure all company property is returned. Paul felt a cold rush, not of anger, but of a profound quiet. He picked up the pen Brenda offered, the plastic cold against his fingers. Is there any room for discussion? He asked, his voice calm, steady, betraying none of the earthquake within him. Chad met his gaze directly. Unfortunately, no, Paul. This decision is final. It's about vision for the future, not about individual performance. Paul nodded slowly, signing where indicated. 22 years distilled into a few clauses, a signature, and a quick walk out the door. He felt a strange detachment, as if watching a scene unfold on a screen. He gathered his things, a small box placed discreetly under the conference room table. A framed photo of Susan and him from their honeymoon in Door County, a well-worn coffee mug, a dog-eared manual for an ancient server system he'd once wrestled into submission. These were the artifacts of his professional life, now ready to be packed away. As he walked past Mike Johnson's cube, Mike looked up, his eyes meeting Paul's. There was a shared understanding there, a silent acknowledgement of the corporate guillotine. Mike offered a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a gesture of silent sympathy. Paul gave a weak, appreciative nod in return. He walked out past the security turnstiles, the fluorescent lights reflecting on the polished lobby floor. The air outside was cool and crisp, a clear autumn afternoon. He climbed into his Ford, the engine starting with its familiar, reliable rumble. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets and houses, but Paul barely registered them. His mind replayed Chad's words, Brenda's polite smile. He thought of all the systems he had built, patched, and kept running over 2 decades. The legacy applications, the undocumented fixes, the intricate network configurations that only he truly understood. He had designed the core architecture, had overseen every upgrade, every migration, had often been the only one who knew how to untangle the spaghetti of old code and new integrations. He was the quiet guardian of their digital kingdom, the one who held the keys to all the hidden rooms and forgotten passages. And now he was gone. When he pulled into the driveway, Susan was tending her small flower bed near the porch. She straightened up, wiping a stray strand of hair from her forehead. She saw the box in his passenger seat, then her eyes met his. Her smile faltered. Paul didn't need to say a word. She just came and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. 13 days. 13 days since Paul Jensen had walked out of the office, his box of personal effects tucked under his arm, the cold truth of his dismissal settling in. He sat at his kitchen table, the sun streaming in through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. His laptop was open, displaying his LinkedIn profile. He stared at his professional summary, trying to find new words, words that would accurately convey 2 decades of dedicated work without sounding bitter or outdated. He was still trying to figure out what his next move should be. His phone vibrated on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Chad Peterson. The name flashed, unwelcome and unexpected. A smirk played on Paul's lips, a small internal victory. He let it ring, watching the timer tick down until it went to voicemail. Chad's voice, when the message played back, was tight, a thread of frustration woven into every syllable. Paul, it's Chad. We're having some issues with the tenant portal. Just some of your old code isn't quite aligning with the new framework. Give me a call back when you get a chance. The forced casualness was almost comical. Paul pressed delete. An hour later, the phone buzzed again. Chad. This time, the voicemail was less composed. Paul, look, this is becoming a serious problem. The portal's completely down. Clients can't log in. We really need your input on this. It's urgent. Delete. The pattern continued. 2 more calls in the afternoon, each one escalating in desperation, the veneer of Chad's professional arrogance cracking with every passing hour. Paul found a quiet satisfaction in listening to the unraveling, the slow dawning realization that they had, in their haste to cut dead weight, severed a vital artery. He spent the afternoon cleaning out the garage, the physical exertion a welcome distraction, the metallic tang of oil and dust a contrast to the sterile air of his former office. By evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Paul's phone vibrated again. This time it was a text. Mike Johnson. System's been down all day. Payment processing failed completely. Chad is having a meltdown. A second text followed almost immediately. Security had to escort him out after he threw his laptop. Total chaos. Paul read the messages twice, a faint smile touching his lips. He imagined Chad, red-faced and furious, surrounded by a team of bewildered, overworked developers, unable to piece together the very systems Paul had built and maintained. He imagined the quiet satisfaction on Mike's face as he sent those texts, a small rebellion in a landscape of corporate coldness. The thought was a warm ember in his chest. The next morning, Paul was out on his small back porch, sipping coffee, watching a great blue heron wade gracefully in the shallow waters of the small lake behind their house. The quiet was profound, broken only by the chirping of cicadas and the occasional splash of the heron. His phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Brenda Hayes. He answered on the second ring. Paul, good morning. It's Brenda from HR. Her voice was different, softer, a shade more deferential than he'd ever heard it. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, Brenda, Paul said, his voice calm, even-keeled. He watched the heron dip its head, then rise, a small fish wriggling in its beak. Paul, we've run into a bit of a snag with some of our legacy systems. It seems your expertise is quite invaluable. Chad and I were hoping you might consider coming back in a consulting capacity. We could offer a quite generous arrangement, given the urgency. Paul took a slow sip of his coffee. How generous, Brenda? He asked, not rushing, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. We could offer you $300 an hour, Brenda said, the words coming out a little faster than before, with a minimum of a 4-hour engagement each time. Of course, all remote work, if you prefer. Paul leaned back in his chair, a faint breeze rustling the leaves of the oak tree overhead. $300 an hour, almost 5 times his old hourly rate. He remembered Chad's arrogant smirk, his words about obsolescence. He remembered Brenda's polite, practiced smile as she handed him the termination papers. "I'll consider it, Brenda," he said, and then, without waiting for a response, he ended the call. He watched the heron take flight, its massive wings beating slowly, powerfully, carrying it out over the shimmering water. Susan came out then, a fresh mug of coffee in her hand, placing it gently in front of him. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft, knowing. Paul looked out at the water, a subtle shift in the light catching his eye. "I'm thinking they're discovering exactly what I'm worth." The next 3 days were a symphony of increasingly desperate digital pleas. Paul Jensen's phone became a relentless beacon of Horizon Properties unraveling. Chad Peterson called, his voice now devoid of any pretense of professionalism, replaced by raw panic. Brenda Hayes followed, her polished HR veneer cracking to reveal genuine concern, her offers of flexibility and generous rates growing with each voicemail. Even Amy Miller, George's daughter, who held a quiet, albeit minor, seat on the board, called. Her message was brief, almost hesitant. "Paul, Dad's really worried. They're in a bad way. Please, just call me back." The litany of failures recited in the voicemails painted a vivid picture of the chaos. The tenant portal, once a reliable hub for residents, was completely unresponsive, a digital ghost town. Maintenance scheduling, a complex web of assignments and contractors Paul had meticulously streamlined over the years, was throwing out random errors, dispatching plumbers to roof leaks and electricians to broken boilers. Worst of all, the automated payment processing, the backbone of their revenue, had completely collapsed, leaving thousands of residents unable to pay their rent or bills and Horizon unable to collect. The local news had even picked up snippets of the story, frustrated residents lining up outside Horizon's regional offices, complaints flooding social media. Horizon Properties, once a pillar of stability, was in full-blown crisis. Paul listened to each message, sometimes more than once, a grim satisfaction settling deep in his chest. He deleted them all, without returning a single call. He spent his time with Susan, doing yard work, reading, simply existing without the relentless hum of corporate demands. He felt lighter, clearer. He had chosen to be quiet, to be overlooked, but never to be disregarded. And now they were learning the difference. On the 4th day, as Paul sat at his old oak desk in the small spare room he now called his office, an unexpected email popped up. The sender, Robert Anderson. The company, Meridian Solutions, Horizon's main competitor. Paul opened it slowly, a prickle of curiosity replacing his usual detached amusement. The subject line read, "Regarding your past contributions." The message was concise, professional, and surprisingly direct. Robert Anderson, Meridian's director of technology, stated he had followed Paul's work at Horizon Properties for years. "I've always admired the robustness and efficiency of the systems you developed there," Robert wrote. "Your reputation for quiet innovation and reliable infrastructure is well known in the industry, even if it wasn't always properly acknowledged in your previous role." The subtle dig at Horizon was not lost on Paul. Robert continued, "Meridian is at a critical juncture. We are looking to modernize our entire property management infrastructure, and frankly, we need someone with your unique blend of technical mastery and industry insight. I'd be very interested in discussing potential opportunities with you at your earliest convenience." Paul reread the email. Quiet innovation. Reliable infrastructure. These were words that resonated, a stark contrast to Chad Peterson's dismissive rhetoric. This wasn't a desperate plea to fix a broken system. This was an acknowledgement of his value, an invitation to build something new, something better. He felt a stir of professional excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He replied promptly, suggesting a meeting the following day. He attached his resume, now updated with a renewed sense of purpose. The email sent, he closed his laptop, a lightness in his step as he walked into the kitchen. Susan was already there, chopping vegetables for dinner, the aroma of garlic and onions filling the room. They were talking about their son Mark's college plans, the quiet rhythm of their evening settling around them when the doorbell rang. It was an unexpected, jarring sound in the calm of their suburban street. No one ever just showed up anymore. Paul glanced at Susan, a frown creasing his brow. An unwelcome intrusion. He walked to the door, feeling a premonition of what awaited him. Paul opened the door to find Chad Peterson standing on his porch. Chad's expensive suit, usually impeccably tailored, was now rumpled. His designer glasses were askew, sliding down a nose that was shiny with sweat, despite the crisp autumn evening air. Dark circles underscored his eyes, making him look far older than his age. He looked less like a sharp CIO and more like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Paul, I apologize for dropping by unannounced," Chad stammered, his voice hoarse, completely devoid of the usual corporate polish. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, like a nervous schoolboy. "But we have an emergency, a real emergency. The entire system is down, everything. The client database, the property management software, even the internal network. Nothing is working. The team can't figure out what's wrong." Paul leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The scent of Susan's cooking wafted faintly from the kitchen, a stark contrast to the desperation emanating from the man on his porch. "That sounds serious," Paul said, his voice quiet, flat. He offered no further comment, no hint of compassion or malice. He just observed. Chad took a deep, shaky breath. "It's worse than serious, Paul. It's catastrophic. We're losing millions. Residents are furious. The media is circling. The board is looking for answers, and they're looking at me." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "We need your help. The board has authorized a substantial fee. Whatever it takes, Paul. Just name your price. We're desperate." He looked up at Paul, his eyes wide and pleading. "Brenda mentioned she spoke with you. We're willing to go higher. $500 an hour. 500, whatever it takes to get us back online. You can work remotely, on your own terms. Just tell us what you need." Paul's mind drifted back a few weeks to the memory of the cardboard box in his garage. Filled with the meager artifacts of his professional life, he remembered Chad's cold, dismissive words. "It's not personal, Paul, just business." He remembered the many times over the years he had pleaded for a dedicated documentation team, for more resources to properly map out the intricate systems he had built and maintained single-handedly. Each request had been met with a polite but firm rejection, deemed an unnecessary expense. "We trust you, Paul," George Miller had said in the early days. Chad Peterson had simply said, "We're modernizing." The silent stretch between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic. Chad's eyes flickered, hoping for a sign, any sign. Paul finally spoke, his voice quiet, devoid of triumph or satisfaction. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles, Chad." The words hung in the air, a polite but firm wall. He paused, letting the weight of his next sentence settle. "But I have an interview tomorrow. Something will turn up, just like I thought." Chad's face fell, the last vestiges of his hope draining away. He opened his mouth as if to argue, to plead further, but no words came out. He looked defeated, truly and completely broken. Paul watched him, a quiet study in the slow, costly unfolding of choices. The kind of choices that change everything. The kind of choices that invite you to stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The click of the front door latch was a small, definitive sound in the quiet Midwestern evening. It sealed off the desperation on Chad Peterson's face, a final period at the end of a long, troubled sentence. Paul Jensen stood for a moment, listening to the silence, and then turned and walked back into the kitchen. Susan looked up from the cutting board, her eyes questioning. He offered her a small, knowing smile, then picked up his knife and resumed chopping the carrots for dinner, the rhythmic thud against the wood a grounding sound. For the first time since his termination, Paul felt a strange, profound weightlessness. It wasn't the burning fire of vindication he might have expected, nor was it the hollow ache of bitterness. Instead, it was an undeniable clarity, a quiet certainty that settled deep in his bones. He knew with absolute and unshakable conviction that he would not help them. He would not fix what they, in their arrogance and short-sightedness, had so carelessly broken. His loyalty had been dismissed, his value negated, and now he had the quiet power to let them face the consequences. There was a dignity in that refusal, a reclamation of self that felt more fulfilling than any act of revenge. His phone, resting on the counter beside the cutting board, buzzed with an unknown number. He glanced at it, then back at the carrots. Another attempt, he thought. He picked it up. It wasn't a call. It was a text message. "You've made a serious mistake, Jensen. Nobody walks away from Horizon." Paul read the words, a faint sigh escaping his lips. Childish. He showed the phone to Susan. Her brow furrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Paul, that's a threat. You should call the police." He took the phone back, his fingers already moving to delete the message. "It's just Chad being dramatic," he reassured her, though he knew the message was probably from Chad, or at least at his behest. He imagined Chad, cornered and desperate, resorting to such tactics. It only reinforced Paul's decision. He'll calm down once he realizes I'm not coming back. He's just lashing out. He deleted the message. The screen went blank. The small threat, though unsettling, felt insignificant compared to the quiet strength he now felt within himself. He had endured far worse, far more subtle forms of professional aggression over the years. This at least was direct. The aroma of dinner filled the kitchen. Chicken and roasted vegetables, simple and comforting. They ate in comfortable silence, talking about Mark's latest email from college, about the weather, about anything but Horizon Properties. The company, which had dominated so much of Paul's adult life, now felt like a distant memory, a shadow he had finally stepped out of. The next morning, Paul woke before the alarm. The house was still, bathed in the soft gray light of dawn. He showered, shaved, and meticulously selected a shirt and tie. He had an interview, a new opportunity, a chance to build, not just to fix. He felt a quiet anticipation, a calm readiness for what was next. The past was behind him, a chapter closed. The future was a blank slate, waiting for him to write it. The Riverside Cafe was a quiet place, tucked away from the main thoroughfare, its large windows overlooking a slow-moving river. It felt miles away from the sterile, corporate offices Paul Jensen had known for so long. Robert Anderson was already seated at a small, round table when Paul arrived, a cup of espresso steaming in front of him. Robert stood, offering a firm handshake and a genuine smile. He looked exactly as Paul remembered him from years ago, sharp, intelligent, but with an underlying sincerity that Chad Peterson had never possessed. "Paul, thanks for meeting me here," Robert said, gesturing to the empty chair opposite him. "Thought this would be a bit more relaxed than a conference room." Paul nodded, settling in. The quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, the gentle rush of the river outside, it all contributed to an atmosphere that instantly put Paul at ease. He ordered a plain black coffee, just as he always did. Robert stirred his espresso, his gaze steady and direct. "I've followed your work for years, Paul," he began, his voice low and clear. "Even when we were technically competitors, I always paid attention to what you were doing at Horizon. That integrated property management system you built there? It's legendary in our industry. We've tried to replicate elements of it, dissected it through every analyst report. But the truth is, nobody else has anything comparable." Paul felt a warmth spread through his chest, a quiet satisfaction that resonated far deeper than any monetary offer. It wasn't flattery. It was a recognition, a genuine appreciation for the years he had poured into his craft, the countless hours spent refining, debugging, and perfecting a system that had become an extension of his own technical mind. "Thank you, Robert," Paul said, a humble acknowledgement of the effort. "It took time." Robert nodded, his eyes meeting Paul's. "That's what I want to discuss. Time and commitment. We're looking to build something similar, something revolutionary for Meridian. Not a quick fix, not an off-the-shelf solution, something foundational, something that will stand the test of time, just like yours did. And we believe you're the only person who can lead that effort." The implication hung in the air, clear and resonant. This was a new beginning. Not a return to a broken past, not a desperate plea to salvage a dying system, but an invitation to create, to innovate, to build from the ground up, with his expertise not just tolerated, but actively sought, truly valued. This was a place where his work mattered, where his quiet dedication would be seen as an asset, not a liability. Paul looked out the window, watching a small boat drift lazily down the river. The morning sun glinted off the water, promising a clear day. The quiet strength of the Midwestern man, unjustly dismissed and undervalued, had found its new path. Not through bitterness or vengeful satisfaction, but through the quiet, confident pursuit of his craft, his hands once again ready to shape the digital landscape, this time on his own terms. The conversation with Robert Anderson flowed easily, extending beyond the initial pleasantries into the deeper currents of system architecture, long-term vision, and the often overlooked value of robust infrastructure. Robert wasn't just looking for someone to patch holes. He was looking for an architect, a master builder who understood that true innovation came from solid foundations, not flimsy, trend-driven facades. "We're not interested in flash-in-the-pan solutions, Paul," Robert explained, leaning forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Meridian has always prided itself on stability, on smart growth. We see technology as the bedrock of our operations, not just some optional accessory. We want a system that isn't just functional today, but adaptable for the next 20 years. That requires foresight, careful planning, and a deep understanding of the intricacies involved. It requires your kind of methodical approach." Paul found himself opening up, sharing his philosophy on system design, the importance of scalability, the necessity of comprehensive documentation, the very things he had fought for, often fruitlessly, at Horizon. He recounted without bitterness the constant push for quick fixes, the demands for immediate results at the expense of long-term stability. He spoke of the countless hours spent untangling spaghetti code, the undocumented patches, the inherent risks of a system that relied too heavily on one person's institutional knowledge. Robert listened intently, nodding in understanding, his expressions conveying genuine empathy and a shared professional perspective. "That's precisely what we want to avoid," Robert affirmed. "We want to empower our people, not just use them up. We want to build a team around you, Paul, a team that understands the value of thoroughness, of foresight. You'll have the resources, the budget, and most importantly, the autonomy you need to build something truly exceptional." Then came the numbers. The compensation package Robert outlined significantly exceeded Paul's previous salary at Horizon, not just the hourly consulting rate. It included generous benefits, a substantial bonus structure tied to successful project milestones, and an equity stake in Meridian's future growth. It was an offer that spoke volumes about how much Robert and Meridian valued his expertise. It wasn't just a job, it was an investment in his legacy. Paul felt a profound sense of professional validation. It was more than just money. It was the recognition he had quietly craved for years, the acknowledgement that his life's work held genuine, irreplaceable value. He imagined building something new, a resilient system from the ground up, free from the constraints and short-sightedness that had plagued him at Horizon. He could finally implement all the best practices he had always preached, create the kind of robust, well-documented architecture that would serve a company for decades. They moved on to logistics, discussing a potential start date, the initial scope of the project, and the kind of team Paul would need to assemble. Paul found himself sketching out ideas on a napkin, his mind buzzing with possibilities. The old spark of enthusiasm rekindled. The challenge was immense, but it was a challenge he was ready for. A challenge where his skills would be truly utilized, truly celebrated. Robert smiled, sensing Paul's renewed energy. "We're excited to have you, Paul. The leadership here is fully behind this initiative. They understand the long-term value." As Paul left the Riverside Cafe, the late morning sun warm on his face, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The river flowed serenely beside him, mirroring the calm certainty that had settled in his heart. Horizon Properties, with its desperate calls and crumbling systems, felt like a distant, fading memory. He was moving forward, not just professionally, but personally. His expertise, his quiet dedication, his years of patient building, all of it finally understood, finally appreciated. The road ahead was clear, and for the first time in a long time, Paul Jensen felt truly free. Paul Jensen pulled into his driveway, the familiar brick house standing solid and comforting under the midday sun. A quiet sense of accomplishment settled over him, different from the fleeting satisfaction of turning away Chad Peterson. This was deeper, more enduring. This was about self-respect, about finding his true worth. He found Susan in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, a faint scent of lemon lingering in the air. She looked up, her eyes immediately searching his face. He didn't need to say a word. The slight upward curve of his lips, the relaxed set of his shoulders. She knew. "So," she asked, her voice soft, tentative. Paul leaned against the door frame, a small smile playing on his lips. "It went well, Susan, very well." He proceeded to tell her everything. Robert Anderson's genuine admiration for his work, the vision for building something new and robust at Meridian Solutions, the promise of resources and autonomy. He detailed the compensation package, the salary, the benefits, the equity stake. He watched as her face transitioned from cautious hope to genuine relief, then to a quiet pride that mirrored his own. That's wonderful, Paul," she said, her voice catching slightly. She walked over and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. He held her tight, feeling the warmth of her presence, the steady rhythm of their life together. They spent the next hour talking, mapping out their future. Mark's college tuition, once a looming mountain of worry, now seemed manageable. They could finally put more away for retirement, maybe even take that trip to the Badlands they'd always talked about. But beyond the financial security, Paul spoke of the professional excitement that had been rekindled. The challenge of building a new system from the ground up, implementing all the best practices he had meticulously honed over 2 decades, leading a team that would value thoroughness and long-term vision. It all invigorated him. "It's like I'm finally getting to do the work I was always meant to do." "Oh," Paul explained, his gaze distant as he thought of the plans already forming in his mind. Without the constant pressure to cut corners, to just keep a rickety old thing from collapsing. Robert understands. He really does. Susan nodded, her hand resting on his arm. "It was wrong what they did to you, Paul. All those years, all that work, and then just like that." She shook her head, a familiar sadness in her eyes. "But this feels right. You deserve this." He thought of Chad Peterson, desperate and disheveled on his porch, and then of Robert Anderson, calm and respectful in the cafe. The contrast was stark, a testament to the differing values of 2 companies, 2 men. He realized he no longer carried the burden of Horizon's problems. That weight, which had subtly pressed on him for years, was gone, replaced by a distinct, quiet freedom. They decided to celebrate with a simple dinner out, just the 2 of them, at the small Italian place they frequented downtown, a quiet marking of a new chapter. As Paul looked around their comfortable home, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, highlighting the dust motes in the air, he felt a deep sense of peace. His quiet Midwestern life, once rocked by corporate upheaval, had found its new equilibrium. He was ready for the road ahead, confident in his decision, ready to build something lasting, something true. Weeks turned into months. Paul Jensen settled into his new role at Meridian Solutions with a calm resolve, the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from finding one's true place. Robert Anderson proved to be a man of his word, providing Paul with the autonomy, resources, and a dedicated team he had always yearned for. Paul led with a quiet authority, guiding his developers through the meticulous process of building a new, robust property management system from the ground up. He implemented every best practice he had advocated for years, emphasizing comprehensive documentation, rigorous testing, and scalable architecture. The atmosphere at Meridian was one of collaboration and respect, a stark contrast to the frantic, short-sighted environment he had left behind. He never once gloated about Horizon Properties' continued struggles, though he heard snippets of news from Mike Johnson, who had eventually found a new, more stable position at a smaller tech firm. Mike's occasional texts painted a picture of ongoing chaos at Horizon. They were still patching, not fixing, attempting to layer new, unstable solutions onto Paul's crumbling, undocumented legacy system. Chad Peterson's ambitious modernization plans had largely stalled, plagued by outages and data integrity issues. Horizon's reputation, once solid, was now publicly suffering, tarnished by customer complaints and missed payment deadlines. Paul simply focused on his work, letting his success at Meridian speak for itself. He found immense satisfaction in the daily grind, in the tangible progress of creating something enduring. He saw his team grow, their skills sharpened by his mentorship, their morale high in an environment that truly valued their contributions. His life at home deepened too. The financial security brought a calm to Susan's eyes, a lightness to her step. They found joy in the simple rhythms of their Midwestern life, quiet evenings on the porch, long walks by the lake, shared meals where conversation flowed freely, untainted by the anxieties of corporate uncertainty. Mark was thriving in college, and they could now easily cover his expenses, a quiet relief. Paul often reflected on the true meaning of value and loyalty. He had given his best years to Horizon, only to be dismissed as obsolete. Yet, in that very act of dismissal, he had been liberated, set free to find a place where his integrity, his craftsmanship, and his quiet dedication were not just recognized but celebrated. He understood that some things, like the intricate systems he built and the quiet dignity he carried, ultimately could not be easily replaced or dismissed. They would always eventually reveal their true worth. The story of Paul Jensen was not one of dramatic revenge or explosive triumph. It was the quiet, understated victory of a man who understood his own value, who chose self-respect over bitterness, and who, in the end, found a greater purpose in building something new, something lasting, something true. He was a quiet man in a quiet town, but his work resonated, his integrity shone, and his new path stretched out, clear and full of promise. He was Paul Jensen, and he was finally home. Paul Jensen began his work at Meridian Solutions with a quiet resolve, the satisfaction of building something new, something right. Robert Anderson had provided him with a team, resources, and more importantly, a respect for the meticulous effort his craft demanded. He found a profound peace in the steady rhythm of creating robust systems, free from the panicked demands and short-sighted decisions that had plagued his final years at Horizon. Horizon Properties, Paul learned through occasional detached reports, continued to falter. Their systems remained a patchwork, the costly quick fixes barely holding things together. Chad Peterson's ambitious vision had curdled into public embarrassment, a slow unraveling of a once solid company. Paul never sought to witness their decline, nor did he feel a triumphant vindication. Instead, he simply focused on his own work, his new path, letting his quiet success speak for itself. He and Susan found a settled contentment in their lives, understanding that true value was not always measured in immediate profit, but in integrity, craftsmanship, and the deep, enduring satisfaction of a life well lived.